Okay. Just give me a second while I open up our agenda.
I thought Jace popped in and popped out. Must be a network glitch.
I'm here, as far as I
Right.
know.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't see your face,
I don't
Jace.
have a face. It's gone. No.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay. So, quick note: Nick Turner messaged me and said that he doesn't have he won't be able to join the meeting today, but he's been working on the CCM for AWS and it's just moving forward. There wasn't any special update from him other than that. Keenan, do you have any updates on what's going on with the AWS EBS
Sure.
implementation?
Yeah, I made some incremental progress on that. So it is moving forward, but nothing big to share yet.
Okay. Um, I'm just writing down notes. Okay. We have a new member here, Chris Heim. Would you like to introduce yourself and
Yeah, absolutely. Hey,
okay.
I'm Chris Hine. I'm actually a partner solutions architect over at AWS as well. Not on the EKS team. I'm kind of just checking out what's going on here and seeing what you guys are doing.
Oh, welcome. We also have another new member, well, an old member who's joining us for the first time. Dims, we've been very active on our community. Thank you for joining us. How can we facilitate whatever is needed for you?
Oh, thank you. Do I call you Sid or
Yeah,
Siddharth?
either works for me.
Okay. So I've been active in trying to get the OpenStack provider out. That's going on really well. We have a CCM for OpenStack binary. We have a provisioner, Cinder provisioner, which is a standalone one, other than the entry thing that we pulled out. Then we also have a CSI plugin. So we have like a bunch of binaries for different, different things that people want to do. The other thing that I was doing was to pull out the Keystone experimental flags that went in yesterday. And then we are going to update the documentation and reflect how to use the webhook that we have in OpenStack, itself. So that's what we are kind of like focusing on right now. So in addition to getting the stuff out, I'm trying to figure out how to test these things in a small environment, OpenStack environment. Typically for OpenStack, we use DevStack to stand up OpenStack, small version, single node. So I ended up adding support in local up cluster to help with both the external cloud providers, which will work for everybody, as well as plugging in a specific binary for CCMs. So that's working right now. Then the next step was to update kubetest to actually call local up cluster and then set the environment variables up for the cloud providers. So essentially, I want to get to a point where kubetest is running local up cluster, which is running the OpenStack provider, external, or any other provider, and then so essentially for CI testing. So
Absolutely.
the kubetest one, I've been kicking the tires for the last couple of days, and that's working fine. So if anybody else wants to try that, and if they see any issues, then that will be a really good feedback that we can use.
So this cube test that you speak of, it's not in the Kubernetes org, right?
It is in the Kubernetes org. It is in test infra.
Test infra, right?
Yes. So kubetest is used by everybody for everything. It supports kops and GCE and Kubernetes Anywhere right now, but there is no single node one. That's why I was adding this one.
Okay, that's very good. So this would directly play into our E2E testing suite, right?
Yes. So the idea is that right now we don't have a single node job that runs only conformance, right? Mm-hmm. So that is the first thing that I need to get up and running. Then the next thing is to switch on a cloud provider and make sure that nothing breaks, right? So that will be the next step. After that, I want to see how we can come up with a limited set of end-to-end tests for testing cloud functionality. Like that will be the third step.
Okay.
You see where I'm going with this? So basically, I want to be sure that when PRs come in, then I can run a subset of these things to make sure that I don't break conformance and test the functionality as well.
Yeah. So, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to bring them up to speed on some of the conversations we've had before. And so Mitra, who's standing behind me, she's the muscle in this room right now with her arms folded, has been working towards getting CI for cloud providers to be able to post back to test grid so that can happen continuously and we get early signal if someone working on one cloud provider inadvertently breaks another in some way. Mm-hmm. And I think there have been some concerns raised about how information gets lost in the signal to noise ratio and how do we set that appropriately. So I think that's going to be the real challenge in this. Right. But I think they've been working mostly with the conformance tests and.
So we've also been starting to look at kubetest. Basically, we have a PR in test infra right now to create a Docker cluster, which will also allow running conformance tests locally, but there's still quite a few steps to be accomplished to reach there. But we can sync up with you so that we can work on it together.
Yeah, sounds good. So there is a concept called OpenLab that we are trying to use for where we are going to run the OpenStack related tests. And that will, hopefully we'll have hooks from there to post back to wherever you point us to for the test results.
And Ben had a finalized document that he was going to publish the working group this week about publishing results to Sonobuoy and then start
to test grid.
From Sonobuoy
to test grid, yes. Right. And that should work for a kube test as well. Right. The goal there was that it's the individual files, not the tarball, that is unique to Sonobuoy there. Mm-hmm. But to pull out the JUnit 0 XML and the logs and post those in a way that's readable by test grid to surface that.
Okay.
So in previous conversations, we were looking for folks who are interested in this area and wanted to participate so we could get 3 or 4 cloud providers posting back and provide a single dashboard so we could see. I think the first layer, as you mentioned, would be that it still passes the conformance test. The second layer that I think was an open conversation in this group was what other tests need an additional label like cloud provider test or something like that.
Yeah.
To demonstrate that the cloud provider is providing the functionality that it needs to.
Right.
And that's
so in terms of OpenStack, it would be like routes, then node information, and LBAS and volume. So those are the 4 things that we would be interested in. So we'll have like a cloud provider, and then under that we'll have like sub labels. I guess.
Is LBAS the load balancer?
Yeah, LBAS is load balancer. And then in our case, we have like a couple of choices for the load balancer. So, we'll have multiple jobs, one for each, I think.
Excellent. So let's pause there. There are some other folks on the call. I want to make sure folks understand what this conversation is about and have a chance to ask questions if they have it.
Yep.
I guess more specific questions. Do other people on this call need pointers to either kubetest or Sonobui or what that, or test grid, or what those aspects mean? Anybody have questions on the layers that we talked about, the conformance or other layer about cloud providers and the specific functionality?
I mean, I have a clarifying question. Someone mentioned that someone named Ben has a document about where to post it to. Is it already public? Can we already look at it?
I'm not sure if he's released it yet. I'll make sure he posts it to the Slack channel. I'll circle back with him.
Okay.
Ben?
Yeah, I think his GitHub handle is Ben the Elder.
Yeah.
So you may have seen him in test infra related work.
Mm-hmm.
And I did see a draft of it. I'm not sure, but anyway, it'll be out soon. He was just trying to clean it up so that folks didn't have to do the forensic analysis of how to post results in a test grid readable way.
Right.
There are some steps that are non-obvious, but I think this is helpful both for cloud providers to know if something happened and they are now broken, and also for engineers making changes that are supposed to be specific to their own cloud provider that inadvertently break someone else. So I just want to make sure that people don't feel stuck and can't make progress, because one of the goals in this project is that individual cloud providers can make progress without waiting for all of the open source project to make progress. So
right, that is the goal of this whole effort. Okay.
I was also going to reach out to all the SIGs to audit what tests they have and whether some of them can become conformants.
Yeah, maybe it's worth, I will drop in a link here. There was so I'm also in the conformance working group discussions, and specifically related to this,
right.
To this group, there was some discussion about how to evolve the conformance test suite, and that overlaps with this group pretty cleanly, or pretty completely. So I will drop in the chat here and in the notes the doc to, which was a brainstorm proposal for how to evolve the conformance test. Specifically, there is a well understood and intentional lack of focus on the coverage of conformance tests while we ironed out what the process is to add conformance tests to that test suite. And so the early effort was in making sure that, some intern somewhere can't just add the label conformance to any test they want and break all the conformance of all the cloud providers and distributions the day before a code freeze and cause some kind of panic. So there is a process in place for adding a conformance test, and SIG architecture reviews that and approves that change. And so now it comes down to, well, the coverage is low. There are lots of E2E tests, which the individual SIGs would propose as conformance tests. And in order of priority, we've identified the workloads APIs as highest priority because that ensures that workloads are portable across environments. There's also some important parts of API machinery that Watch is supported, that garbage collection is enabled and working. And then there are just placeholders for something like Node. I think there will be some that are obvious, and then I think there will be more discussion as we get into things like Node and our, VMs that behave like nodes in or out. And I expect there will be some conversation in SIG architecture around some of those more complicated cases. So I'm intentionally pushing off the hard conversations till later. But that's what Mitra is talking about with approaching the SIGs and saying, could you please, propose the list of tests you think of as conformance tests. And if there are any gaps, the CNCF has contracted with a vendor to try to fill those gaps with new EDE tests. The important part of this is it's a one-time amnesty. They don't want to fund all the testing forever. And I don't think we should get into the habit of depending on a vendor to supply E2E tests. That said, this could help close the gap more quickly. Any questions on that?
Well, just to say that, not questions, comment, that Signo is working on their list of conformance tests because they have to, for the Signo Windows work, as defined what is conformance.
Excellent.
So those will probably dovetail. If you're interested in the no specific stuff, UG is running that.
Excellent. Somewhere there's a, I can't find the notes anymore, but I will drop this into the notes as well.
I have a question for Walter. Hey, Walter.
Hey, Sid, how's it going?
Good. How are you? So my question is about the generic cloud controller manager proposal.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of activity this week. What are we? How is it looking so far?
So yeah, I'm actually very pleasantly surprised. When I had originally at KubeCon proposed this to Red Hat, they seemed a little bit concerned about the idea, but it seems like STTS has picked it up and actually started running with it. And his first check-in, I think, definitely makes things better. So I want to build on top of what they've already begun. And in fact, STTS has a fairly good overarching issue that he filed with some of the concerns. And I think it's a really good starting place for the things I think need to happen on generic cloud manager.
Is this a generic, generic cloud controller manager, or is it just a generic controller manager?
Or generic controller manager, right? I mean, what I would love to see is get to the point where, you know, we start all the control. I mean, so back up a sec. Red Hat, I think, would actually like to see more than just 2 controller managers, which I think is why they've sort of started moving in the direction I was suggesting. But whatever the reasons, what I'd love to see is we start abstracting this to the point where you can say, look, here's a controller manager. There's a controller interface. The controller interface will tell you important things like what configuration is needed, how the manager should act if the controller doesn't start cleanly, what handlers it needs, etc., so that we can just, you know, plug in the controllers that a given controller manager needs and minimize the amount of work that has to happen and make it a lot easier to share a lot of the how controllers work so that we get consistent behavior, especially when you start looking at things like the node IPAM, where that's something that's going to have to end up running in the cloud controller manager. But I think it's something that we'd really like SIG Network to continue owning for the most part. And so the more we can try and keep it behaving consistently, the easier it's going to be for that stuff to work.
So do you envision these everything but the generic controller to be plugins, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry. I said I'd have a proposal today, and I don't. But yeah, my vision is if we can come up with a good controller interface that, for the most part, things can just be plugins where you just add whatever controller you need as a plugin. Obviously, you know, it's up to the individual cloud provider if they want to use it. My goal, though, is to do this well enough that it just makes sense and makes everyone's life easier if they do. But honestly, you know, it's their own repo. They can do whatever they want. But if we do it right, it should make their lives enough easier that it's worth it for them to do it.
Right, and making it plugin based will also help them keep up with upstream more easily rather than having to.
Yes. And that way, I mean, when we look at things like the node IPAM, we might even keep something like a pared down version of the cloud provider interface so that they may want to keep reusing that controller within the plugin and just add what they need to do things like the IP lookup, the route creation, etc.
Sounds cool. Looking forward to seeing that proposal.
True.
It's written here now. Walter really will come up with a proposal soon. Yeah.
Yep.
Limited time and resources in life is always a bummer. But if you have thoughts or feedback on that, please do reach out to Walter or Chef Taco.
Please reach out with any concerns. There are definitely some things that I think we need to think over. One I will mention just quickly as an example is whether we can have sort of ordering dependencies between controllers. And I mentioned that mostly as something I thought of and think we shouldn't do. I think it would be better if the controllers were independent, but I mentioned that one because I'm sure that one's going to have at least one person who can think of a reason why I'm wrong. And so I'd love to have that discussion early.
Well, I'm on your side. I don't think there should be a dependency between the controllers.
Agreed, but if someone has a use case that I'm missing, I would love to talk about it and see, can we convince ourselves that despite the use case that we're still right or that we're wrong, but let's really understand the problem before we box ourselves in.
I'd be surprised if there was a use case like that because, we can coordinate using the distributed state on etcd.
Yep. That's what I'm trying to convince myself is always the right way of doing things.
So one of the things that Brendan Burns was talking about having concern about was things running in containers when containers might not have the access levels to accurate metadata about node status. Did we really talked about that much, or has that been a thing? Because I'm late to a lot of these discussions because I had conflicts for this meeting for the longest time. So the idea basically running some sort of binary on the node allows for the node to, you can introspect a lot more of the metadata that might be specific to how that node is interacting with the cloud provider versus if it's calling out to a container and the container may be on any node and there's not necessarily an implicit tie back to whatever the metadata is. So that implementation detail, at least from the Azure perspective, could be really damaging, devastating, because there's all these crazy things about how disks mount and stuff like that. So has that been a topic of conversation?
I mean, I'm kind of confused here because we try to stay away from metadata service because, again, we're running a single instance of the external cloud controller manager and we're not on every node. So we're really not talking to the metadata service. We're directly talking to the cloud APIs.
I mean, that having been said, I think there's at least one of the examples Jace brought up, which, I mean, I'm going to sidestep it, even though I'm going to suggest it's a good thing to think about. As far as mounting, unmounting, etc., a lot of the perspective has been, we're going to try and deal with this via either Flex or CSI, and I think most of us prefer CSI. And so while I completely agree with Sid that the general goal on the controller manager is probably running one, maybe 3 instances for HA in the master. Something like CSI probably is going to need to have a sidecar running on every node.
Yes.
And so, I mean, and that is my way of deliberately sidestepping your question, Jason. I apologize for that. But I think at some level that probably will be sort of the paradigm we're looking at for trying to deal with some of these things, where we say, look, we'll come up with a standard interface like the CSI interface, and if an individual kubelet needs to do something metadata or cloud provider specific, our preference would be that it works through a system like that with a standardized interface, so that, the differences between an Azure persistent disk and a GCP persistent disk don't matter to the customer, and so we can get easy, straightforward migration by using that standard interface.
Yeah, and these, I mean, I think Brendan had more specific concerns. It might be, you know, I would love to see if I could get him to attend this meeting once, just to kind of raise those concerns. And he had more grave concerns about it than I do, because I do feel like a lot of these abstractions, in theory, I mean, nodes shouldn't be special from the controller standpoint. I mean, any kind of node-related specificity should be handled through annotations or other mechanisms. So, or sidecars at the worst case.
Yeah.
So I mean, if nodes are calling out to some sort of service, it should be, I mean, there should be ways baked into the controller to be able to handle that and not necessarily have to exist on every node. Because otherwise you get into the weird stuff that happens with daemon sets and whatnot, and
right.
control actions.
And this is also where we get, I mean, we're going to get some interesting things with things like KMS, but again, I mean, SIGAuth, or not SIGAuth, SIG Security, is dealing with trying to come up with a common KMS interface. And I mean, so I think mostly, you know, we have to rely on the other SIGs knowing their areas well and doing what's best for the community.
Yeah. I mean, the gRPC-based interfaces is going to be interesting. I mean, that poses some interesting architectural challenges. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, like, in a lot of ways, these concepts of generalities are ahead of where we're at in terms of cloud implementations. And, you know, a lot of this back-end infrastructure stuff is catching up, right? I mean, everybody's infrastructure, you know, 5 years ago was optimized for the massive case. And now we're talking about, you know, breaking into these tiny little components and delivering them. That's a big challenge. So we just need to be patient and try and accommodate the use cases and deprecate where we can.
Yeah.
So it's 10:29. We're just about out of time. I would suggest that maybe there are two ways to share this information with someone like Brendan. One is getting him to come here. The other is us going to the community meeting, for example, and giving an update there. I think it would be worth getting on the agenda there in about 3 or 4 weeks.
Yes.
And giving an update. I think there is interest and sometimes just general concern that something's happening that people aren't aware of, or so I think it would be useful to give an update there and a sort of perceived timeline, and just share what's been happening here, so that we don't end up being the concern part of this project. So we'll follow up on that. But thanks, everybody. Any closing remarks, Sid, before we call it?
Yeah, I had one request. I pasted it on the chat, 58613. I need help thinking through that. I have a proposal there with a snippet of code, but I wasn't sure whether it's the right thing to do. So please comment on that and we can continue the conversation there.
Absolutely, I will take a look.
Okay.
The closing remarks are Happy Valentine's Day. And Jace, if you have a link to a document or meeting minutes about what Brendan Burns was concerned about, that would be great.
Okay. Yeah, I think it was in SIG architecture last time, maybe. So I'll see what I can come up with.
All right.
And summarize, and we'll figure it out. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
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 Be hard.